It started with a house, not remarkable from the outside, just another brick terrace in the quiet grey sprawl of Normanton, West Yorkshire. It looked like any other on the street. Faded lace curtains, a mailbox rusted shut, a door that hadn't seen new paint in over a decade. But inside, beneath the floorboards, was something no one expected, something that had waited in silence for nearly 15 years. They say time erodes everything, memories, truths, even people. But sometimes it simply buries them, and when it finally resurfaces, the damage is sharper than ever imagined. In 2024, a property inspection team entered the abandoned home for a routine check. What they found wasn't routine at all. Human remains, hidden, decomposed, forgotten. That discovery sent shockwaves not just through the town, but through an entire system that had failed someone so quietly, so completely, that her absence was never even noticed. Her name was Isabella Zablocka. She was 30 years old. She had dreams, a voice, a reason to come to the UK. And yet, after she arrived in 2010, she disappeared. No headlines, no search parties, no missing person report. For almost 15 years, her name didn't exist in any police database. Her face was never printed on a flyer. There was no family on TV pleading for answers. She vanished from life, and no one asked why. But now, nearly a decade and a half later, 4 people have been arrested in connection to her suspected murder. And the questions echo louder than ever before. What really happened to Isabella Zablocka? How could a person disappear without a trace, and more chillingly, without anyone even noticing? This isn't just the story of a disappearance. It's the story of silence, of what it hides, who it protects, and who it erases. But to understand what really happened, we have to go back. She was born in Poland in the late 1970s, a time when the country was still shaking off the cold grip of communism, and the promise of the West shimmered like a distant light. Isabella Zablocka grew up in a small working-class town where family dinners were sacred and opportunity felt more like a hope than a plan. Friends remember her as quiet but warm, someone who didn't command rooms but filled them gently, with presence, with calm, with quiet resilience. She loved flowers, not just the way they looked, but what they represented. Life blooming in places people forgot to look. She'd once told a friend that her dream was to open a small florist shop where she could name each bouquet after someone she loved. She kept a notebook of pressed petals. Every page was labeled in careful handwriting. Soft memories, preserved in silence. Like many others in the early 2000s, she began looking west. Poland had joined the European Union, and a generation of young adults were suddenly handed keys to doors they never thought they'd reach. The UK, in particular, became a beacon, a place where work was plentiful, where wages, though modest, stretched further than back home. For Isabella, it was more than economics. It was escape, a quiet reset. In 2010, she boarded a budget airline flight from Warsaw to Leeds, Bradford. One suitcase, one destination, Normanton, West Yorkshire. A small town, once thriving on coal and textiles, now surviving on warehouses, construction work, and quiet routines. It wasn't glamorous, but for many Polish migrants, it was a place of promise, or at least a place to start again. Isabella moved into a shared house on Barden Avenue, a street tucked away from the town center, lined with modest red brick homes, the kind of place where everyone minds their own business, and silence isn't questioned. She was seen walking to the local convenience store, speaking softly in broken English as she paid in coins. She smiled at the cashier but never lingered. Her housemates, fellow migrants, came and went. Some remember her being withdrawn. Others say she seemed kind but guarded. She cooked simple meals, sent money back to her mother, and rarely spoke about her past. There was no drama, no alarms, no one who thought she was in danger. That, perhaps, was the most haunting part. She worked a cleaning job at an industrial site on the edge of town. Night shifts, long hours, the kind of work that slips past most people's attention. Invisible labor that keeps the world running but rarely gets noticed. Her employer noted she was punctual, quiet, and never missed a shift. Until one day she did. But even then, nothing happened. No red flags, no investigation. Just a replacement quietly added to the schedule, and Isabella's name, like so much else in her life, slowly erased. In communities like Normanton, especially among migrant populations, lives often run parallel to the systems meant to protect them. Without close family nearby, without a strong social circle, a person can disappear without causing even the smallest ripple. The house on Barden Avenue continued to be occupied. Tenants changed. People moved in and out. Rent was paid. The address remained active, but somewhere inside those walls a secret was hiding, and no one knew or cared enough to look closer. Her absence wasn't documented, it wasn't questioned, it wasn't mourned, it simply happened. Years later, one of her former colleagues would recall a strange feeling, a sense that Isabella hadn't just left but had been erased. She didn't say goodbye, he said. She just vanished, and none of us did anything. Not one of us asked why. In those first few weeks there were no police calls, no reports. Her family in Poland thought she was busy, working, maybe trying to find her footing. They didn't have regular contact. Weeks became months. Silence became habit. Assumptions filled the void. And the house remained. Isabella Zablocka had come to the UK to start a new chapter, but instead she became its most tragic footnote, a person who existed in the margins of society until even the margins let go. No alarms, no searches, no goodbyes, just silence. And somewhere behind that silence, something darker was waiting. It was sometime in mid to late 2010, the exact day still uncertain, when Isabella Zablocka was last seen alive. No one would mark that moment at the time. No doors were kicked in, no sirens screamed, no headlines splashed her name across pages. But looking back, it was a line in the sand, a quiet fracture that no one saw coming. The last verifiable sighting of Isabella was in her neighborhood, walking home with a shopping bag. It was one of those overcast afternoons, the kind West Yorkshire is known for. Cold, but not quite raining. Dim, but not quite dark. She passed the corner shop. A neighbor recalled seeing her at the letterbox. Nothing unusual, nothing urgent. She wasn't running, she wasn't afraid, she just existed, and then she didn't. After that moment, she stopped going to work. Her employer, used to the churn of migrant labor, didn't think much of it. People left without notice all the time, sometimes returning to Poland, sometimes moving on to other jobs, towns, or countries. With no emergency contacts on file and no family visits on record, Isabella's absence didn't raise suspicion. A name was crossed off a rota and someone else was quietly added. There were no calls to the police. There were no appeals. Not a single missing person report was filed. In the early months after her disappearance, her rent was still being paid. The room she had once occupied remained closed. Other tenants came and went, barely registering her absence. They said she had always kept to herself, always quiet. Maybe she'd gone back home. Maybe she found another job. Maybe, and this was the most common answer, maybe she just didn't want to be found. Normanton is a place that doesn't ask too many questions. It's a working town, practical and proud. But it's also a place where people come to disappear or to hide in plain sight. In homes shared by strangers, in shifts worked at odd hours, in cultures and languages that don't always cross. Migrants form their own rhythms, their own worlds. And when one person falls out of that rhythm, the rest simply keep moving. By the time the months had turned into a year, Izabela Zabloka had already begun to slip from memory. Her family in Poland, unsure of her address or phone number, assumed she was simply busy, that she'd started a new life, that she'd call when she could. In many Eastern European households, distance is endured, not questioned. Migrant children often disappear into the rhythm of work abroad, writing when they have money, visiting when they have time. But Izabela never called, she never wrote, she never visited, and the silence deepened. What's perhaps most chilling about her case is not just the disappearance itself, but the way it was absorbed by the fabric of the town. There were no immediate clues, no blood, no broken windows, no signs of struggle. If anything happened inside that house, it left no echo loud enough to reach the street. Years later, forensics would suggest that her remains had been there all along, concealed within the property where she once lived. But at the time, there was nothing, not even a trace. For over a decade, the property remained active in some form, rented, occupied, passed between landlords. Tenants shifted, lives moved on, and Izabela's name, her life, her body, stayed hidden. There's something devastating about a disappearance that generates no urgency. No one panicked. No one waited at a window. No one posted her face on lampposts. It wasn't just that she vanished. It was that no one noticed. The authorities would later confirm that no missing person report was ever filed for Izabela. In every legal and investigative sense, she didn't vanish, because she was never even marked as missing. She simply ceased to be visible, and that lack of visibility made the perfect cover for whatever had happened. In the years that followed, the police would never knock on her door. Journalists never wrote her name. Cold case units never investigated her fate, because to them, she didn't exist. The silence surrounding her wasn't just emotional, it was institutional. It would take nearly 15 years before anyone would ask the first real question, before someone would look closely enough at the walls she once called home, before anyone would ask, "Where is Izabela Zabloka?" But in those early days, those critical first hours, weeks, months, the case was already slipping through the cracks. Somewhere, a person vanished. Somewhere, a crime may have been committed. Somewhere, behind a closed door, a secret was buried, and no one knew. The disappearance of Izabela Zabloka isn't a story of panic or urgency. It's not about chaos or pursuit. It's about a different kind of horror, the slow, quiet kind, the kind that doesn't scream, the kind that waits, the kind that gets away with it. She was gone, and the world moved on. There would be no search dogs, no forensic teams, no CCTV frames frozen in time, no last text message, no farewell voicemail, just silence. And in that silence, the years would pass, until finally something cracked. But that wouldn't happen for a long, long time. When someone disappears under violent or suspicious circumstances, the most critical moments for finding answers are the first 48 hours. After that, the chances of solving a case drop dramatically. But in Izabela Zabloka's case, those 48 hours didn't even happen. No phone rang, no file was opened, no one noticed she was gone. And so, the hours turned into weeks, the weeks became months, and eventually, the months became years. In Normanton, life moved forward, slowly, quietly. The local corner shop changed owners. The house where Izabela had once lived continued to host tenants, its walls silent witnesses to something no one could see. Her name faded, not deliberately, not cruelly, just passively, the way a faint chalk mark disappears after enough rain. In Poland, her mother still believed her daughter was abroad, working hard, maybe struggling, but trying to build something better. Communication had always been infrequent. Not every migrant called home often, and not every family had the means to stay in touch. Postcards had stopped coming, but no one sounded the alarm. Years later, during media coverage of the case, a neighbor would say, "People just assumed she'd gone back to Poland," or found a new job. She didn't really talk to anyone. She was quiet, and that silence became her undoing. The early 2000s and 10s saw thousands of Eastern European migrants arrive in the UK, most of them working low-wage jobs, many of them without family networks. For women like Isabella, life existed in between things, between shifts, between borders, between belonging. It was easy to become invisible, and even easier to stay that way once something went wrong. No one filed a missing person report. No alerts were posted to migrant forums. There were no police inquiries, no worried employers, no friends showing up at her door. Isabella's name never entered the system. Without that, there was nothing to investigate. For years, she was a ghost with no file. And while the world around her moved on, those who may have known what happened stayed quiet or disappeared altogether. People moved, records were lost, property ownership shifted. Time, as always, buried the truth deeper. Some of her old co-workers eventually assumed she'd simply moved on. One woman, who worked the same cleaning contract, said she remembered Isabella's absence, but chalked it up to exhaustion. "Sometimes people just leave," she said. "No one questions it. You get tired, or someone offers better money in Leeds, or your visa expires. People just vanish." But Isabella hadn't moved to Leeds. She hadn't flown home. She hadn't started over. She was still there, trapped inside a building that no one looked too closely at. Her body, her truth, her silence. And for nearly 15 years, she remained hidden in plain sight. There were no anniversaries to mark her absence, no public candlelight vigils, no faded photographs taped to telephone poles, no pressure on police to do more, because, officially, there was nothing to do. She had simply fallen off the edge of the world. Years passed. By 2014, 4 years had gone by. Entire news cycles came and went. The UK changed prime ministers. Immigration policy hardened, austerity deepened, but no one said her name. By 2016, the house she had lived in had been passed between landlords. Some tenants came and went without even knowing a woman named Isabella had once lived there. Any remnants of her life, clothes, photos, documents, were gone, replaced by new furniture, new people, new silence. By 2018, the world was in a different place. Brexit loomed. Conversations about migrants had become more hostile. The language around people like Isabella had changed. Workers became burdens. Neighbors became strangers. But still, no one spoke her name, not even once. Her file didn't exist. She had become a footnote in no one's book. Somewhere in that same time frame, her mother passed away in Poland, never knowing what happened to her daughter. She died thinking Isabella had simply chosen a different life. Maybe she'd found love. Maybe she didn't want to come back. The silence had rewritten the story. That, perhaps, is the cruelest part of all. By 2020, nearly a decade had passed. The COVID-19 pandemic had locked the world down. People were suddenly forced to notice those around them, or those missing. But even then, Isabella's story didn't surface. Not yet. Behind the walls of the house on Barden Avenue, the remains stayed hidden, and the silence deepened further. But silence doesn't mean peace, and absence doesn't mean closure. There were still people, a few, who remembered. A name scribbled in a notebook, a passing face in an old photo, an empty chair in a rented kitchen. They may not have asked questions out loud, but somewhere a question hung in the air. Where did she go? And why did no one ask? It would take another 4 years before those questions would finally be answered, or at least finally asked by the people with the power to act. By then, it was already too late to save her. But maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late to hear her. For nearly 15 years, Isabella Zablocka's name was absent from missing persons databases. She had no digital footprint after 2010, no public case file, no family interviews. And because her disappearance went unreported for so long, speculation began only after the discovery of her remains. But once the case surfaced in 2024, theories flooded in, first quietly, in local whispers, and then online, where sleuths and strangers tried to piece together what the silence had hidden. Some of the earliest public theories focused on human trafficking. In 2010, the UK was already seeing a sharp increase in Eastern European women being trafficked into domestic servitude, forced labor, or sex work. Polish nationals were among the top groups vulnerable to exploitation, especially those who didn't speak fluent English or who lived in informal housing arrangements. Could Isabella have been trapped in something far more sinister than she let on? Some speculated that she may have initially come to the UK on her own, but been lured or coerced into something else. There were no reports to confirm this, but the very absence of records, the lack of social media, bank transactions, or work documentation only deepened the mystery. Another theory emerged from those who had known her peripherally, that Isabella had simply become overwhelmed. The weight of migration, isolation, language barriers, and financial pressure may have driven her into a mental health crisis. Some suggested that perhaps she took her own life and her body had been hidden or overlooked. But as more details emerged about where her remains were found, buried within a property she once lived in, the suicide theory began to lose credibility. People don't bury themselves. That detail, the concealment of her body, marked a critical shift in how investigators and the public viewed the case. Suddenly, the story was no longer about a missing person. It was about a murder, a deliberate erasure. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure she would never be found. And for a time, they had succeeded. The home on Barden Avenue became the center of attention. Neighbors were interviewed, tenants from years past were tracked down, and inconsistencies began to surface. One former tenant, speaking anonymously to a local newspaper, recalled a strange smell in the house's back room. Another remembered being told not to use the basement. A woman who had sublet a room there in 2012 claimed that one of the men in the house acted like he owned the place, despite not being listed on the lease. She said he was controlling and that Isabella had seemed scared of him. But because no one had reported anything at the time, and because records had been poorly kept, these statements were difficult to verify. Then came the online forums. Reddit threads and Facebook groups dedicated to unsolved UK cases began drawing parallels between Isabella's case and other disappearances involving migrant women. Some noted that the length of time her body remained hidden, nearly 14 years, suggested that whoever was responsible had either been close to the property or had influence over it for a long period. It wasn't just a moment of violence, it was a long, cold concealment. This led to a theory involving a network or group rather than a single perpetrator. Some speculated that Isabella had been killed in a shared house, and those living there had helped cover it up, either out of fear, loyalty, or complicity. That theory gained traction when 4 individuals were arrested following the discovery of her remains. But even those arrests raised more questions than answers. Who were these people? Why had they never been investigated before? And most disturbingly, were they living free all those years, while Isabella remained buried in the walls? The police offered few details in the early days of the reopened case. It was an active investigation, they said. But the lack of transparency only fueled more speculation. Some online users began reviewing tenant registries, property records, and immigration files. Others tried to piece together Isabella's movements through public transport data, though gaps in surveillance footage from 2010 made that virtually impossible. Then came the theory of institutional failure. This wasn't just a crime of violence, some argued. It was a crime made possible by bureaucratic silence. Migrant workers like Isabella often operate in the shadows of society. They may not register with GPs, they often live without official leases, and in some cases, landlords or employers exploit their legal ignorance. So, when something goes wrong, no one knows, or worse, no one cares. Was Isabella failed by the system, or was she never part of it to begin with? Several migrant advocacy groups, following the news of her remains, pointed to her case as a textbook example of how vulnerable populations disappear without leaving a trace. They called for reforms in housing oversight, labor protection, and social service outreach, particularly for isolated women. Yet the silence around the details of her case persisted. What was the motive? Had there been abuse? Did someone exploit her isolation? Did she try to seek help? Those questions remained unanswered and, in some cases, unaskable. Even after the arrests, police refused to confirm how she died. Her remains were too decomposed, they said, but the fact that they had been deliberately concealed told its own story. A final theory emerged, not from evidence, but from fear. That maybe Isabella's death wasn't meant to be personal. Maybe she was killed because she was easy to make disappear. No one would ask questions. No one would look. No one would file the paperwork. And that perhaps was the most haunting truth of all. Not just that someone killed her, but that whoever did it knew they could get away with it. It was spring in Normanton, April 2024. The air was thick with that strange mix of bloom and dust, the scent of things waking up after a long winter, mixed with the forgotten corners of a town that never quite stopped sleeping. On Barden Avenue, the grass between pavement cracks had grown wild. The same brick house where Isabella Zablocka once lived now stood in disrepair. Its windows smudged with grime, the mailbox still rusted shut. The property had been empty for months. Officially, the landlord had listed it for routine renovation. In reality, the house had become a burden. Too many complaints from tenants, too many rumors of something off in the basement. The walls felt damp. The air inside was stale. Rooms sat untouched for years, and when the latest potential renters pulled out, a maintenance inspection was scheduled. That morning, a small team arrived to assess the property. Just 2 contractors, neither of them knew the history of the home. For them, it was just another assignment, another faded house in need of fixing. They walked through the ground floor, peeling wallpaper, dust-thick air, light filtered in through yellowing blinds. The back door stuck when opened. Nothing unusual, until they reached the rear utility room, once used as a storage space. There was a low crawl space beneath the floor, boarded over, sealed with cheap plywood. One of the workers bent down, noting the warping in the boards. "Smells like mold," he muttered. He pried up a corner, then he stopped. What hit him first wasn't the sight. It was the smell, not mold, not rot, something older, heavier, something wrong. Within minutes, they had pulled back the boards, revealing what had been hidden for over a decade. Human remains, partially buried beneath loose soil and broken tiles. The body was not whole. What was visible was skeletal. Fragments of ribs, a disintegrating piece of clothing, something that might have once been a shoe. Time had not been kind, but it had not erased everything. The workers backed out of the room, one of them vomiting in the hallway. The other fumbled with his phone. Police were called. By noon, the property was sealed off with yellow tape, and a forensic tent had been set up over the crawl space. The story, long silent, had cracked wide open. The discovery made the local news that night. Skeletal remains found in Normanton property. Investigation underway. It didn't mention a name. Not yet. At that point, no one could have known it was Isabella. But someone, somewhere, did, and they had kept it hidden for nearly 15 years. Within days, forensic teams began analyzing the remains. Despite the advanced decomposition, a few critical identifiers remained: clothing fibers, a dental record match, and eventually a DNA confirmation from biological material obtained from distant relatives still living in Poland. The name was finally spoken: Isabella Zabloka. Her story, erased for so long, now returned with force. News outlets from West Yorkshire to Warsaw ran headlines: "Missing Polish woman identified after 14 years, remains found in former home." For many, it was the first time they had ever heard her name. For others, those who had lived near her, worked with her, even forgotten her, it was a shocking re-entry into a chapter they thought was closed. Neighbors were stunned. "That house?" one woman said, her voice trembling on local news. "I walked past it every day. We thought she moved away. We never knew." And yet others began remembering strange details. One man recalled noises coming from the property long after it was supposedly empty. A former tenant described a locked room, always locked, that no one was allowed to enter. Another, more haunting memory, a housemate who once joked, years ago, that someone could die in this place and nobody would notice. That line would replay endlessly in online forums, in news clips, in documentaries to come. The discovery sparked immediate questions. Why hadn't the property been investigated sooner? Who was responsible for hiding the body? How did so many people live in, around, and near that house and never suspect a thing? Police released a brief statement confirming the identity of the remains and announced that the case had been reopened as a homicide investigation. They appealed to the public for any information about the residents and activities in the house during 2010 and the years that followed. The press swarmed the neighborhood. People stopped on the street, pointing at the police tape, whispering theories. The house became something between a crime scene and a monument, to neglect, to secrecy, to everything that went unseen. But for Isabella, there were no family members in the UK to step forward, no relatives at the scene, no friends laying flowers by the gate. Her life had ended quietly, and for a moment it seemed like even her discovery would fade into silence again, until the arrests came. Just weeks after the remains were confirmed to be hers, West Yorkshire police made a public announcement. 4 individuals had been taken into custody in connection with her suspected murder. That revelation changed everything, because it meant this wasn't a case of misunderstanding or self-inflicted tragedy. This was a crime hidden, a crime concealed with such efficiency that it had gone undetected for over a decade, right under the noses of a town, a neighborhood, and a country. The identities of the arrested individuals were not immediately released, but rumors began circulating fast. Former housemates, acquaintances, a former landlord, a man who had reportedly been in a relationship with her, people who knew her, people who may have lived with her, people who in some way had stayed close to the body for years. The implications were chilling. In the days that followed, Isabella's story made national headlines. Migrant rights organizations spoke out, demanding accountability not just from the suspects, but from the system that had allowed her to disappear without a trace. One advocate said it plainly. She was buried in her own house and no one even checked. What does that say about how we treat people like her? And beneath all the noise, the outrage, and the disbelief One detail stood out above all. The only reason Isabella Zablocka was found was because the house had been scheduled for renovation. Not because someone came forward, not because of a lead, not because someone finally spoke the truth, but because a piece of plywood had begun to warp, because someone lifted it up, because the bones could no longer stay hidden. It wasn't justice that found her. It was chance. And now, everything was about to change. Once the remains were confirmed to be those of Isabella Zablocka, the tone of the investigation shifted instantly. What had once been treated as an abandoned property issue had become the center of a long-buried murder case, one that revealed not only personal betrayal, but institutional failure at multiple levels. The house on Barden Avenue was no longer just a building. It was a crime scene, possibly the last place Isabella had ever been alive. Police sealed it off. Forensics teams returned daily. Inside, they found more than just bones. They found what time had failed to fully erase. Fragments of clothing, evidence of disturbed floorboards, signs that someone had deliberately hidden a body, not simply left it behind. Detectives began to rebuild what had been erased. They pulled tenancy records, immigration files, and old employment documents. Every scrap of paper bearing Isabella's name became a thread in a new timeline. Officers began tracing every known resident who had lived in that house between 2010 and 2014. Some were easy to find, still living in West Yorkshire. Others had moved, changed names, or left the UK altogether. Many said they remembered nothing. Others claimed not to have known Isabella at all. But under pressure, stories began to change. A former resident admitted that he recalled arguments in the house late at night, sometimes in Polish, sometimes in broken English. One woman remembered that Isabella stopped showing up for meals, but she assumed she had found another place to stay. Another man claimed to have been told by a housemate that Isabella had gone back to Poland suddenly. There was a pattern in the testimonies. People had noticed something. They had felt something. But no one had done anything. And somewhere, within that inaction, the truth had quietly survived. One breakthrough came when police obtained a phone number tied to a utility bill from the property. The number led to a man in his early 40s, previously unconnected to any known investigation. He had lived in the house briefly in 2010, the same year Isabella disappeared. When questioned, he denied knowing her, but phone metadata painted a different picture. His phone had pinged at the property multiple times after he claimed he moved out. His number was linked to WhatsApp messages in Polish, exchanged with a contact later identified as a woman arrested the following week. This was the beginning of the chain. By the end of that month, 4 individuals had been arrested. 2 men and 2 women, all of Eastern European origin, all previously connected to the Barden Avenue address. Their names were withheld at first, but the charges were clear: suspected murder, failure to report a death, obstruction of justice, and unlawful concealment of a body. The arrests ignited a new wave of outrage, not just at the suspects, but at the institutions that had allowed the crime to go unnoticed for nearly 15 years. Investigators combed through Isabella's past, old employer records, salary logs, bank transactions. They found that her account had been dormant since October 2010. Her phone had been deactivated that same month. Her national insurance number had no further employment entries. It was as if her life had stopped mid-sentence. And yet, no one had noticed the silence. Detectives now believed that Isabella had been killed sometime between August and October 2010. Though the cause of death was still officially undetermined, due to the state of decomposition, they were confident enough in their findings to build a murder case. Behind the scenes, forensic anthropologists and pathologists worked tirelessly. They examined the bones for signs of trauma. In the remains of her clothing, they found fibers from a plastic tarp, possibly used to wrap the body. Nearby, they discovered remnants of duct tape and an old, rusted nail that had been bent in a way suggesting forceful use. Police began reconstructing the interior of the house as it had looked in 2010. They used old photos, tenancy agreements, and even statements from neighbors to piece together who had access to which rooms and when. The reconstruction helped confirm what they already suspected. The crawl space where her body had been hidden was not accessible without intent. It had been deliberately chosen as a hiding place. They also discovered that the previous landlord, while not directly involved in the crime, had failed to report multiple tenant disputes and had ignored complaints about bad smells and sealed rooms. Though not criminally liable, his negligence had indirectly contributed to the long delay in discovery. Meanwhile, prosecutors worked to build a narrative for the eventual trial. The theory, based on months of interviews and evidence, was this: Isabella had been involved, possibly romantically, possibly not, with one or more of the suspects. There had been tension in the house. At some point, a confrontation occurred. Whether it was spontaneous violence or premeditated murder remains uncertain, but what followed was clear. Isabella was killed, her body hidden, and the house continued to operate as if nothing had happened. Those involved had maintained the illusion of normalcy. They paid rent, they changed locks, they lived alongside her secret, and no one outside the house had noticed a thing. The reopened investigation made headlines in Poland as well. Journalists tracked down extended family members. One cousin, speaking through tears, said, "We thought she just wanted a new life. We never imagined she was dead, that she died so long ago, that she died alone." Migrant advocacy groups pointed to Isabella's case as a grim example of what happens when entire communities live without safety nets. They called for new regulations on shared housing, better tracking of vulnerable workers, and stronger enforcement of missing persons protocols, especially for those without immediate family in the UK. The investigation sparked parliamentary debate. One MP stood in the Commons and asked, "How many more Isabellas are out there? How many women have vanished, unnoticed, because the systems we build were never designed to see them?" But amid all the fury, something else was happening, something quieter, something slower. Isabella Zablocka's name was finally being spoken, not as a case number, not as a rumor, but as a woman who had existed, who had suffered, who had been forgotten, and who had finally been found. And though the investigation was far from over, one truth had already emerged from the silence. Isabella had not disappeared. She had been hidden. And now, the truth was coming into the light. The truth, or at least what could be pieced together of it, arrived slowly, not in a single stunning reveal, but in fragments, testimonies, forensic results, court documents. It came like Isabella's disappearance had, quietly, with shadows at its edges. After months of investigation, police publicly confirmed what they now believed had happened to Isabella Zablocka in that small house on Barden Avenue in 2010. It wasn't a random crime. It wasn't a tragic accident. It wasn't suicide. It was murder. Though the exact method of death could not be determined due to the advanced state of decomposition, the concealment of her body, the positioning of her remains, and evidence of trauma to her ribs and skull made one conclusion unavoidable. Isabella had been killed and then hidden deliberately, not in haste, not in panic, with time, tools, and a plan. One of the arrested individuals, a man who had lived in the same house, eventually broke. Under pressure during questioning, he confessed to helping move the body. At first, he claimed he didn't know Isabella had been killed, that he was only helping a friend take care of something. But that lie unraveled quickly. Phone records showed he remained in contact with others involved for years. He knew. He had always known. the official charge brought against him: conspiracy to conceal a death and pervert the course of justice. But it was the second suspect, a woman in her early 30s, also from Poland, who brought the most damning revelation. In court documents, she was identified only as Witness B. She admitted she had witnessed the events leading to Isabella's death, and she had stayed silent for 14 years. According to her testimony, Isabella had been in a volatile relationship with one of the men now facing murder charges. Their arguments were frequent and grew increasingly aggressive in the weeks before she vanished. Witness B stated that on one particular evening in late summer 2010, a loud fight broke out in the kitchen. Isabella had threatened to leave. She had packed a small bag. She had said she was going back to Poland. That night, she never left. Witness B said she saw the accused dragging someone, through the hallway. She didn't intervene. "I was scared," she said. "He told me not to talk, that no one would care anyway." And for years, no one did. It was this testimony, combined with forensic analysis and metadata from long-deleted text messages recovered through digital forensics, that gave prosecutors the narrative they needed. Isabella was murdered inside her own home. The motive, though never confirmed, appeared to be a mix of control and rage. A man unable to accept being left, a woman isolated and unsupported, an environment where violence could happen and stay hidden. The jury listened to weeks of testimony. Experts explained how the crawl space had been sealed, how her body had been wrapped in plastic and weighted down with pieces of concrete and tiles, how signs of decomposition had been masked by strong cleaning chemicals. The air in the crawl space had carried those chemicals, mixing with decay, explaining the strange smells some tenants remembered and ignored. The most painful part, perhaps, was how close the truth had always been. One of the new tenants in 2011 had actually slept in the room directly above her remains for almost a year. He told police, "I always felt something wasn't right, but I couldn't explain it. I thought it was just the cold." The trial stretched over several weeks. In the courtroom, a small photo of Isabella, one of the few that survived, sat quietly by the prosecution bench. She was smiling, wearing a light coat, her hair brushed back. It was a face the world had not seen in over a decade, and now it looked out over her own case, a case that had almost never existed. The verdict came in early November. Guilty. 2 of the 4 individuals arrested were convicted, one for murder, and the other for conspiracy and concealment. The remaining 2 were released due to insufficient evidence, though the court acknowledged they likely knew more than they had admitted. The man convicted of murder was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 22 years. He showed no visible emotion as the sentence was read. The court fell into an uneasy silence, not celebratory, not relieved, just quiet, as if no one knew how to feel about justice delivered so late. The lead detective, speaking outside the courthouse, said what many were already thinking: "We didn't just fail to stop this crime, we failed to even notice it." For those watching from Poland, the pain was harder to quantify. Isabella's few surviving relatives, including 2 cousins and a distant aunt, had traveled to the UK for the verdict. One cousin, Magdalena, spoke to the press. "We didn't even know she was dead until this year. All that time we thought she just wanted to stay away. We were wrong. She didn't disappear. She was taken." They held a small memorial for her in West Yorkshire a few days later. Just a few people, some white flowers, and her photo on a fold-out easel. There was no body to bury. Her remains had been kept for forensic analysis and evidence. Her ashes would eventually be sent back to Poland, but her memory, now painfully resurrected, would stay behind. For the detectives who worked the case, there was relief, but also regret. One officer who had led the reopened investigation said, "I've been in this job for 20 years, but this case, it made me question everything, because it wasn't just a murder. It was a disappearance so complete, it almost worked, and that was the final undeniable truth. Isabella Zablocka had not been forgotten because no one cared. She had been forgotten because the world made it easy to forget her. A quiet woman, an immigrant, a life lived on the edges of a town, inside the corners of a house. A woman who dared to start over and never got the chance. And now, even with her name cleared, her killer behind bars, and the truth finally exposed, one haunting question remained. Why did it take so long for someone to ask where she went? The verdict was in. The man who had murdered Isabella Zablocka was in prison. The headlines had run their course. The police had packed up their forensics vans and taken down the yellow tape from Barden Avenue. But for many, those who had followed the case, those who had known her even in passing, and those who had never known her at all, the story didn't feel finished, because something still didn't make sense. How does a woman disappear, not for days or months, but for 14 years, without anyone noticing? Not one phone call, not one missing persons report, not one public search. How could an entire life be erased so cleanly, so completely, that even after death, she remained hidden just a few feet below the floorboards? Even with the trial over, there were no easy answers. The house where she had lived and died remained standing. The property changed hands again, sold quietly to a developer who planned to demolish it and build new apartments. Some saw that as justice, others as erasure. One neighbor said, "That house will always be haunted, not by ghosts, but by silence." Silence had been the true accomplice in Isabella's death. The kind of silence that grows in overlooked places, the silence of unfamiliar accents, of migrants who don't speak fluent English, of neighbors who mind their own business, of systems too overwhelmed or indifferent to notice someone fading from view. And though the courtroom had delivered its sentence, it had not delivered peace, because what still haunts this case isn't just what happened, it's what didn't. There were no alerts, no investigations into her absence, no procedures triggered when her employment stopped. She had fallen through every net, and no one realized there had been a net at all. Several UK charities and migrant advocacy organizations began pressing the government for reform. They pointed to Isabella's case in white papers and open letters to Parliament, demanding a system that tracks disappearances more seriously, especially among high-risk, isolated individuals. One question echoed loudly through those discussions. Should there be a legal mechanism to flag unreported absences? If a worker misses too many days, if a bank account remains dormant, if someone stops using a registered NHS number, should that trigger an alert? Critics argued it would be intrusive, that privacy would be compromised, but supporters asked, at what cost? Because in Isabella's case, privacy became a coffin. The justice system had acted, eventually, but there were still major gaps in the timeline. For instance, how many people had entered that house over the years? How many saw signs and said nothing? Was there anyone else involved who escaped charges? One of the released suspects had moved abroad in 2016 and only returned in 2023. During the investigation, police uncovered private messages sent from her to the convicted killer, messages discussing what lies beneath, but prosecutors couldn't prove she had been present during the concealment. She walked free. Her silence was legal. And then there were the rumors, unverified claims from former tenants that they had been told not to snoop, that they heard digging in the middle of the night, that bleach was used so often in one corner of the house, the wall paint peeled. Could so many people have lived so close to death and not known? Or had they chosen not to know? One journalist who covered the trial later wrote, "It wasn't the murder that chilled me most. It was the way the world allowed it to remain hidden, the way ordinary people normalized something that should have felt deeply wrong." In Poland, her remaining relatives struggled to make sense of it all. They had spent years believing Isabella had chosen distance, that maybe she was too proud to come home, maybe she had failed and didn't want to admit it. One cousin confessed to living with guilt. "I should have called more. I should have pushed harder to find her, but I thought she was just trying to start over." That phrase, "start over," became a tragic refrain. Isabella had come to the UK to build a life, to work, to live in peace. She was never looking for attention. And, in the end, that humility had made it easier for her to disappear. The haunting part? It could happen again. There are thousands of migrants living in the UK and across the world, just like Isabella, without strong support systems, without consistent documentation, working long hours, moving frequently, renting rooms in places where landlords don't ask questions. For some, that anonymity feels like freedom, but for others, it's a trap. The legacy of this case wasn't just the conviction. It was the way it forced a conversation about invisibility, about who we notice, about who we think deserves protection, about how systems fail not just through corruption or abuse, but through indifference. One police officer, reflecting in a BBC interview, said, "We can say we solved her case, but we didn't save her." And that's something I think about every night. Even the judge who sentenced the killer remarked during the hearing, "This court recognizes that while justice is served today, it does not undo the years of silence that followed this crime. Justice delayed is not justice denied, but it is still justice grieved." In Normanton, a mural of white lilies appeared quietly on a brick wall a few blocks from where Isabella once lived. No one claimed responsibility. No name was signed, just the flowers, her favorite, and beneath them a small line of text, "You mattered. We see you now." The mural became a place where people left candles, letters, notes in Polish and English, a scarf, a photograph. Someone left a pressed flower inside a plastic sleeve, its page labeled with careful handwriting. It was the only memorial Isabella had. And still, even as her name now appeared in reports and articles, even as documentaries were made about her story, even as law students studied her case, what remains most haunting is that for 14 years she was right there, and no one knew. There's no twist ending to this story, no last-minute rescue, no reappearance. There is only a truth unearthed too late, and a silence that lasted too long. In the weeks following the verdict, life in Normanton returned to its usual rhythm, at least on the surface. The buses still ran on time, shop windows still displayed discount signs, children still played in front yards, oblivious to the headlines that had, for a brief time, made their quiet street the center of a national reckoning. But underneath, things were different. The house where Isabella Zabloka had once lived and died was now permanently empty, boarded up. A single notice taped to the door: "Unsafe structure, demolition pending." To some it was closure, to others it felt like burying the evidence again. But for those closest to the case, especially the few who still remembered her as a person, not just a story, life after the truth became a new kind of struggle. For her cousins in Poland, the days after the trial were filled with grief that had no instructions. They hadn't known her body was in England, but now they had to plan what to do with the ashes. A GoFundMe campaign, started by a Polish-British community group, raised enough to cover cremation costs and a small memorial stone. It would be placed in the village cemetery where her mother was buried, a symbolic reunion for a mother who died not knowing what happened to her daughter. One cousin, speaking at the memorial, said, We can't bring her home the way we wanted, but we can bring her name. We can bring her truth." Meanwhile, the police officers who had reopened her case found themselves deeply changed by the experience. Detective Inspector Sarah Kemble had worked in serious crimes for over 20 years, but Isabella's case lingered with her. She began speaking at conferences on missing persons protocol, particularly about migrant invisibility. In one interview, she said, "We spend a lot of time training for high-profile cases, but no one prepares you for the kind of case that no one even realized was missing. It shook my understanding of what justice even means." For her, and others like her, Isabella became more than a name on a report. She became a mirror, a measure of the cracks in a system designed to respond only when someone is looking and someone is shouting. And then there was the neighborhood. Barden Avenue would never be the same. Several residents who had lived there during the 2010s moved away after the discovery. One family requested a transfer to another council estate, citing psychological distress. Another resident, who had shared a wall with Isabella's former unit, told a newspaper, "It's not the ghosts that scare me. It's the guilt that we didn't notice, that we didn't ask." The ripple effect extended further. Community centers in West Yorkshire began offering free legal aid clinics for migrants, helping them register with doctors, file work documents, update visas. There was a noticeable spike in interest. Women especially came forward with questions. Some even admitted they knew people who had gone off the radar and wanted to check in. In London, a non-profit called Silent Lives was formed, inspired by Isabella's story. Its mission, to track at-risk individuals living in informal housing or under-the-table employment. Their slogan was blunt but unforgettable: "You deserve to be counted, even when you're quiet." For a woman who had been forgotten, Isabella was now, finally, being seen. And in the legal world, the consequences were just beginning. Her case triggered a full review by the Home Office into how missing persons files are initiated, especially for foreign nationals without local family. The report, released a year after the trial, made 14 policy recommendations, among them automatic welfare checks for abandoned rental properties, flagging dormant immigration records beyond 12 months, enhanced training for local authorities on migrant vulnerability. The recommendations were not without controversy. Some feared surveillance, others welcomed the safety net, but what everyone agreed on was this: Isabella's case should never have happened, and certainly it should never have lasted 14 years. Universities added her case to criminology curriculums. Sociology students examined the socioeconomic patterns that left her vulnerable. Her name was mentioned in lectures alongside better-known cases, but always with a note that hers had gone unheard for far too long. But not all consequences were policy. Some were personal. A retired neighbor, Mr. Adams, who had lived on Barden Avenue for 25 years, became a kind of accidental witness to the aftermath. He had seen Isabella once or twice. He remembered her smile, the way she always nodded in greeting. After the trial, he began writing letters to her, just short lines tucked inside a notebook. He read one at a local community meeting. "Dear Isabella, I didn't know you were gone. I didn't know you were still here. But I know now, and I'll keep saying your name." Others followed suit. A small gathering took place in Normanton every August, the month Isabella had likely died. Locals, mostly women, lit candles and held a moment of silence. Some brought flowers, some just stood quietly, but each year more people came. And that became her legacy, too. Not just the law changes, not just the headlines, but the fact that she made people notice the space left behind when someone disappears, and the responsibility we all share in not letting that space go unexamined. Isabella had no children, no surviving parents. No grave with her name carved into it, not yet, but she had changed the lives of people who never knew her. In the end, justice had come, but it had come with scars. Scars on a town, scars on a justice system, and scars on the hearts of those who wished they'd done something differently. Asked one more question, knocked one more time, followed one more instinct, because what haunted them most wasn't just the murder, it was the years in between, the years she was there, and no one knew. In most cases of murder or disappearance, the moment of conviction marks the end. The files are closed. The headlines fade. Life returns to its usual pace, and the name at the center of the tragedy slowly becomes just another story in the archives. But with Isabella Zablocka, the story didn't end when the courtroom emptied. In many ways, it had only just begun, because what had happened to her wasn't just a crime. It was a revelation, a mirror held up to society's blind spots, a question still echoing in the silence she left behind. How many others have disappeared and gone unnoticed? Her case inspired a wave of media interest, not out of voyeurism, but because of the unthinkable simplicity of her vanishing. She wasn't abducted in a dramatic scene. There were no haunting CCTV frames, no panicked 999 calls. She was simply missed. Missed by neighbors, missed by institutions, missed by everyone, until the very structure that hid her began to collapse. And that eerie, quiet horror made people pay attention. Podcasts took up her story. The Vanishing File, Echoes of Silence, Cold Years. Each of them devoted full episodes or series to Isabella. They didn't just cover the facts, they dissected the implications. What does it mean when a person is not missed? What kind of world allows that? Her name began trending across true crime forums. Reddit threads dissected the layout of the house, the failure of systems, the cultural divide that had made her vulnerable. TikTok creators with millions of followers began telling her story, frame by frame, reminding their audiences that this wasn't fiction, that this happened in their country, in their lifetime. And slowly, Isabella's name became more than a cautionary tale. It became a symbol. In 2025, an independent documentary premiered at the Sheffield International Documentary Festival titled Below the Floorboards, The Life and Silence of Isabella Zablocka. It was raw, quiet, and deliberate, just like her. It didn't dramatize her death. It humanized her life. The documentary showed images never before released of her neighborhood in Poland, her handwriting on the back of an old photograph, a recording of her cousin remembering their childhood games. It closed with a single line whispered over the final scene. "We didn't hear her go, but we hear her now." The film won 2 awards and was streamed by millions. For some, it was the first time they had heard of Isabella. For others, it was a long overdue reckoning. More importantly, it sparked institutional introspection. Local councils across the UK began revisiting unresolved tenancy disputes and unverified welfare claims from the last 2 decades. In one instance, a missing person was found alive. A man with mental health issues who had lived off the grid for 8 years, never formally reported missing. He was reunited with family. The officers involved quietly credited Isabella's case as the reason they looked. Her story also breathed life into old forgotten cases. Journalists and volunteers reopened files of other Eastern European migrants who had disappeared in the UK, particularly women. Cases once considered low priority were suddenly re-examined under a new lens, with the assumption that silence doesn't mean consent, and absence doesn't mean choice. A national charity launched the Zablocka Project, a network for foreign workers to safely report abuse, neglect, or disappearances in their communities. The project partnered with embassies, shelters, and immigration lawyers. Within months, it was flooded with requests for help. Isabella, who had once died without a whisper, was now speaking through action. But the mystery still lingered, because even with justice served, so many questions remained unanswered. What exactly happened in that house during those final hours? Why didn't any of the other residents speak up? Were there other victims? Not of murder, but of silence. Could Isabella's killer have hurt others? And perhaps the hardest question of all, would she still be alive if someone had knocked? These weren't questions a trial could answer. They were questions that now lived in community halls, in classrooms, in advocacy circles. In 2026, a college in Leeds launched an annual lecture in her name, the Zablocka Address on Social Invisibility. It focused on those living in the margins, immigrants, undocumented workers, isolated elderly. Each year, survivors and activists gathered to talk about systems that fail quietly and how to make them loud. One speaker, a domestic worker from Romania, said on stage, "When I was cleaning houses, no one looked at me. I could have disappeared like her. I still might. But now, at least I know her name. And if I vanish, maybe someone will say mine, too." And there, in that auditorium, in front of an audience holding candles, it became clear. Isabella's story was no longer hers alone. It had become a vessel, a symbol of lives forgotten and lives still at risk. A mural of her face was painted on a community center in Wakefield. It wasn't the kind of polished tribute one sees in official spaces. It was raw, a portrait painted in grays and whites, her eyes looking straight ahead. No smile, no tears, just presence. Below it, someone had spray-painted the words, "She was here, we weren't." The mural became a place for stories. People began leaving notes, not just to Isabella, but to others they had lost. One read, "To my sister, who never came back from her job interview in London. I miss you every day." Another, "I didn't ask if she was okay. I wish I had." In these small acts of remembrance, Isabella's mystery lived on, not in confusion, but in clarity. Because what remains is no longer about who killed her. That answer we know. What remains is about the system that let her vanish, the silence that swallowed her, the people who lived above her bones, the missed calls, the unchecked mail, the unopened door, and most of all, the voice that was never heard until it was too late. Now, when people walk past Barden Avenue, they remember. Now, when a tenant goes missing, someone asks sooner. Now, when a story sounds too quiet, too convenient, too clean, people listen differently. And in that shift, however small, however late, Isabella Zablocka lives on. There are stories we hear, and stories we feel. Isabella Zablocka's story was almost neither. For 14 years, it lay beneath dust and drywall, behind closed doors and boarded windows. It didn't scream. It didn't cry for attention. It simply waited, unseen, unheard, unfelt, until time, accident, and a rotting floorboard finally cracked the silence. And then we began to listen. We call it a mystery, but the mystery wasn't where Isabella went. Not really. Her body never left the house. She was there the whole time. The real mystery is how an entire world managed not to notice. How someone's absence could echo so softly that it sounded like nothing at all. How a life could vanish, not with drama, but with indifference. That is what stays with us, not just the cruelty of her death, but the quietness of her erasure. We expect evil to come with noise, a scream, a struggle, a blood-stained scene. But in Isabella's case, evil came with silence, with long pauses, with unanswered questions, with the kind of emptiness that people walk past every day, assuming someone else will fill it. She was not famous, She was not powerful. She did not leave behind a string of social media posts or a frantic family campaign. She was a woman trying to start over, trying to live. And in that vulnerability, she became the kind of person systems forget. The kind people assume must be fine, simply because they don't hear otherwise. But silence isn't proof of peace. It's just the absence of sound. And in that absence, Isabella Zablocka disappeared. They say time heals all wounds, but time did not heal this. It hid it. It gave the illusion of distance, of safety, of closure. Until her bones told the truth, her voice was never given the chance to. We now know what happened to her. We know who was responsible. We know what was concealed, but what we don't know, and may never know, is what might have happened if someone had knocked, if someone had asked, if someone had refused to accept her absence as ordinary, if someone, anyone, had said, "She's missing, and I won't stop until she's found." That never happened, and that's why this story matters, because it is a reminder, chilling and painful, that justice doesn't always begin with outrage. Sometimes it begins with an accident, a warped board, a smell, a question finally asked too late. But justice delayed is not justice denied, because in the end her story was heard, and once it was heard, it could never be forgotten. Isabella is not just a victim, she is a voice, a warning, a name that now echoes louder than the silence that once buried it. Her photo, once lost, now appears on the walls of classrooms, on the covers of reports, on murals painted by strangers who never met her, but refuse to let her be erased again. She has become a question we cannot ignore. Did she disappear? Or were we just not looking? How many others live in the shadows of our cities, our policies, our prejudices? How many lives begin to vanish the moment we decide they don't belong in the light? Isabella didn't ask for fame. She didn't ask for a legacy. She asked once for a chance to build something better, to grow roots, to matter. She did matter. She does. And now, every candle lit in her name, every law rewritten, every voice raised on behalf of someone vulnerable. All of it is proof that even the quietest stories can change the world. So, the next time someone disappears, ask sooner, look harder, listen closer, because behind every silence there might be a voice trying to be heard, and behind every closed door there might be someone waiting.